The Hidden Cold War: How the CIA Secretly Engineered Coups Worldwide. In the aftermath of World War II, as the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as global superpowers, the world quickly divided into two ideological camps. The Cold War had begun, but the battles were not fought on conventional battlefields. Instead, they unfolded in shadows, through espionage, political subterfuge, and covert operations designed to manipulate governments, destabilize regimes, and secure U.S. interests abroad. For decades, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, operated as the primary instrument of American covert action. While the Cold War was often portrayed as a struggle of ideals, democracy versus communism, it was also a ruthless contest for influence over the governments and resources of nations worldwide. Now, with the release of a fresh trove of declassified CIA documents, a clearer picture emerges of how deep and far-reaching this covert campaign was. These documents reveal the lengths to which the U.S. government went to secretly engineer coups, overthrow elected leaders, and install pliant regimes, all under the guise of protecting democracy. The genesis of covert coups. The CIA was created in 1947 under the National Security Act, a new law aimed at coordinating America's intelligence capabilities. From the beginning, the agency's mandate extended beyond intelligence gathering. It was tasked with covert action, including psychological warfare and secret operations to influence political outcomes in foreign nations. Early on, the agency developed a doctrine: the global spread of communism represented an existential threat to American interests. The agency's leaders and policymakers believed that any government leaning towards socialism, especially if allied with the Soviet Union, must be destabilized or removed. One of the first major covert coups orchestrated by the CIA occurred in Iran in 1953. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, alarming British and American interests. Fearing the loss of access to oil and the spread of Soviet influence, the CIA launched Operation Ajax. Using a combination of propaganda, bribery, and the mobilization of street mobs, they succeeded in overthrowing Mossadegh and reinstalling the Shah, a pro-Western autocrat. The operation was hailed as a triumph at the time, but its repercussions were long-lasting. Iran would endure decades of authoritarian rule, culminating in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, a backlash in part fueled by resentment toward U.S. interference. Latin America, the backyard of empire. Latin America became a principal battleground for CIA covert activities. The U.S. government viewed the region as its backyard, determined to prevent any leftist government from taking root. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of Guatemala's democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz had embarked on a series of land reforms that threatened the interests of the United Fruit Company, a U.S.-based corporation with vast holdings in the country. The CIA's Operation Success used propaganda campaigns, psychological warfare, and paramilitary forces to topple Arbenz. The ensuing military dictatorship plunged Guatemala into decades of brutal civil war and repression. Similarly, in 1961, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion marked a CIA attempt to topple Cuba's revolutionary leader, Fidel Castro. Despite the operation's catastrophic failure, the agency continued to wage clandestine efforts to destabilize Castro's regime throughout the Cold War. Chile's 1973 coup is another stark example. After Salvador Allende was democratically elected as a socialist president, the Nixon administration authorized the CIA to disrupt his government through funding opposition groups, fomenting strikes, and ultimately supporting the military coup that brought General Augusto Pinochet to power. The coup ushered in years of dictatorship marked by torture, disappearances, and repression. Africa and Asia, the global chessboard. Beyond the Americas, the CIA's covert coups spread into Africa and Asia, often targeting newly independent nations where nationalist or socialist movements challenged Western dominance. In the Congo, the CIA played a pivotal role in the 1960 assassination of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, a nationalist leader who sought to reduce foreign influence in his country's vast mineral wealth. Lumumba's death precipitated decades of conflict and dictatorship under Mobutu Sese Seko, who became a key U.S. ally. In Indonesia, the CIA covertly supported the 1965 coup that ousted President Sukarno and installed General Suharto, whose regime was responsible for mass killings and repression. These coups often came at the cost of countless civilian lives and widespread human rights abuses. The untold costs of power. Behind the clandestine operations lay a dark ledger of unintended consequences. Many of the leaders installed or supported by the CIA became despots, ruling through terror and suppression. The disruption of democratic processes and the violent repression of opposition often sowed deep social divisions and long-term instability. The documents also reveal the moral ambiguity of these actions. Officials who authorized coups were frequently motivated by Cold War realpolitik, the belief that any means justified the end of containing communism. Yet, these operations frequently betrayed America's professed commitment to democracy and human rights. The recent release of thousands of CIA documents, once hidden under layers of secrecy, has shed new light on the agency's role in orchestrating covert coups worldwide. These files, spanning decades, show a methodical pattern of intervention cloaked in misinformation, bribery, and manipulation. For historians and analysts, the documents offer unprecedented insight into how covert operations shaped global politics in the 20th century. Yet they also raise profound ethical questions about the cost of power and the true price paid by ordinary people. The architecture of a coup. Declassified memos reveal a blueprint for covert operations that the CIA refined over decades. Each coup was meticulously planned, blending intelligence gathering, propaganda campaigns, and direct action. The agency first identified vulnerable governments, typically those with leftist or nationalist leaders threatening U.S. geopolitical or economic interests. Then, it recruited local agents, politicians, military officers, and sometimes criminal elements to carry out the destabilization. Propaganda efforts aimed to sway public opinion, often through forged documents, manipulated media, and staged protests. Financial resources flooded opposition groups to ensure they could challenge the incumbent regime. The CIA also coordinated with foreign intelligence services, such as Britain's MI6, and sometimes with military forces to ensure the operation's success. Whenever possible, the agency maintained plausible deniability, leaving the local governments to bear the brunt of the blame. Case study: Iran 1953 Revisited. The newly released documents about Operation Ajax provide a clearer picture of the techniques employed to unseat Mossadegh. Beyond the known tactics of bribery and street protests, the CIA funneled money to influential clerics and tribal leaders, tapping into social divisions to erode Mossadegh's support base. Detailed instructions directed agents to exploit fears of communism, exaggerate internal chaos, and promote the Shah as a stabilizing force. The operation's success depended as much on psychological manipulation as on the physical removal of Mossadegh. These documents also reveal the agency's internal debates, with some officials warning that overthrowing a democratically elected leader risked long-term blowback. Yet the operation moved forward, driven by the imperatives of Cold War politics. Guatemala's success, a template for intervention. The Guatemala coup remains a stark example of the CIA's capacity for covert action. Newly declassified cables show how the agency leveraged the existing dissatisfaction of local elites, mobilized paramilitary forces, and launched a relentless psychological warfare campaign. Agents distributed fake leaflets warning of communist purges, broadcast false radio messages to create panic, and orchestrated strikes to paralyze the economy. The agency also worked closely with the United Fruit Company to frame Arbenz as a communist puppet. After the coup, Guatemala spiraled into civil war, with U.S.-backed governments committing widespread human rights violations. The documents show that agency officials were aware of these risks but considered them acceptable collateral damage in the fight against communism. Latin America's cascade of coups. Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and other countries in Latin America also saw covert operations to destabilize leftist governments or movements. The CIA's approach evolved, incorporating lessons from earlier coups. In Chile, newly released cables reveal direct CIA funding of opposition groups, including media outlets and labor unions. The agency also worked to disrupt the country's economy, encouraging capital flight and strikes to create chaos. Brazil's 1964 military coup had covert U.S. support, with CIA agents facilitating communication between rebel officers and supplying resources. In Argentina, the agency provided intelligence and logistical aid to military regimes that cracked down on leftist activists. These operations contributed to decades of authoritarian rule and repression in the region, the social wounds of which are still healing today. Africa and Asia, a continent-wide web of influence. The Cold War's ideological battle was global, and Africa and Asia became focal points for CIA covert action. In the Congo, the agency's role in Lumumba's assassination was confirmed through recently released cables, showing direct coordination with local operatives and Belgian intelligence. Lumumba's removal cleared the way for Mobutu's long dictatorship, which became emblematic of Cold War-era U.S. support for authoritarian regimes. In Southeast Asia, the CIA engaged in covert operations to counter communist movements. During the Indonesian mass killings of 1965–66, documents reveal agency support for anti-communist forces and assistance in identifying targets. Similar patterns emerged in Laos, Thailand, and the Philippines, where covert aid, propaganda, and paramilitary support were tools in the broader geopolitical chess game. The human cost. While these documents illuminate the mechanics of covert coups, they also reveal the staggering human toll. In Guatemala, the CIA's intervention ignited a civil war that claimed over 200,000 lives. In Indonesia, estimates suggest over 500,000 people perished during the purges following the 1965 coup. Chile's Pinochet regime tortured and disappeared thousands. In Iran, decades of authoritarian rule triggered widespread unrest and suffering. Victims included political dissidents, labor organizers, indigenous communities, and ordinary citizens caught in the crossfire. The CIA's secret wars fueled cycles of violence and repression that shaped entire generations. The ethics of covert power. These revelations spark enduring debates about the morality of covert interventions. On one hand, U.S. officials argued that preventing Soviet expansion justified aggressive action. The Cold War was an existential struggle in which traditional diplomacy was often insufficient. Yet the secretive nature of these coups meant a lack of accountability. Democratically elected governments were overthrown, and brutal regimes installed, all in the name of security and ideology. Many historians now question whether the short-term gains were worth the long-term costs. The disruption of sovereignty and the undermining of democratic institutions sowed distrust toward the U.S. that persists today. The legacy of deception. The newly declassified documents serve as a stark reminder of how deeply covert action shaped the post-war world. They expose a pattern of interference that prioritized geopolitical objectives over the principles of self-determination. The CIA's role in these coups was a well-kept secret for decades, but the truth now demands reckoning. As nations grapple with the legacy of these interventions, the story challenges us to reconsider how power is wielded in the shadows, and at what cost. The revelations brought forth by the declassified CIA documents are more than historical curiosities. They compel a deeper reckoning with the consequences of covert interventionism. For decades, the agency's clandestine operations remained shrouded in secrecy, their outcomes obscured behind layers of propaganda and official silence. But the full human, political, and moral costs have since rippled across generations, countries, and continents. The aftermath of covert coups. In many countries where the CIA engineered regime changes, the political landscape became profoundly destabilized. Democratically elected leaders were replaced by authoritarian rulers whose primary allegiance was to foreign interests rather than their people. Such power shifts disrupted social fabrics, eroded trust in institutions, and in some cases, triggered cycles of violence and insurgency that persist today. In Iran, the 1953 coup sowed the seeds of anti-American sentiment that culminated in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The overthrow of Mossadegh was remembered as a national humiliation and betrayal, fueling decades of animosity that still influence U.S.-Iran relations. Latin America's dirty wars, with their mass disappearances and torture under military regimes, left deep psychological scars. Families lost loved ones to political violence, entire communities were displaced, and democratic traditions were stifled. The U.S. government's covert role in supporting such regimes is now widely criticized, casting a shadow over its professed values. Truth and transparency. The role of declassification. The release of these documents marks an important step toward transparency and accountability. Governments around the world have started to confront uncomfortable truths about their own histories and foreign interventions. Declassification efforts, while often incomplete and politically selective, have empowered scholars, journalists, and activists to piece together a more accurate narrative of the Cold War era. These records challenge simplified stories of democracy versus communism and expose a complex web of power, pragmatism, and moral ambiguity. They also raise important questions about how democracies should balance national security interests with respect for sovereignty, human rights, and the rule of law. Lessons for today's geopolitics. The legacy of CIA-engineered coups remains highly relevant in today's geopolitical landscape. Modern intelligence agencies continue to wield significant power, and the temptation to intervene covertly in foreign affairs persists. Reflecting on the Cold War era's hidden wars invites caution. The unintended consequences of past operations illustrate that covert action can easily backfire, fostering instability and resentment rather than security. As new global challenges arise, from authoritarian resurgence to digital misinformation campaigns, there is an urgent need for clear ethical guidelines and international norms governing covert intervention. The untold cost of power. At its core, the history of CIA-engineered coups is a story about the costs of power, both for those who wield it and those who bear its consequences. For the United States, it reveals a paradox. The promotion of democracy abroad often involved undermining democracy at home. The sacrifices demanded by realpolitik left moral scars on the nation's conscience and complicated its role as a global leader. For the countries targeted, it meant the disruption of self-determination and the imposition of foreign will, often at great human cost. The shadow wars of the Cold War era shaped political trajectories, social divisions, and historical memory in ways still felt today. Epilogue: Moving beyond the shadows. The story of the hidden Cold War is not just a tale of espionage and coups, it is a cautionary tale about the consequences of secret power. It reminds us that democracy and sovereignty are fragile, and that true security requires transparency, accountability, and respect for the rights of all peoples. As the world moves forward, the lessons of this history must guide policy and practice. The cost of covert coups, measured not only in geopolitical terms but in human lives and aspirations, must never be forgotten. The declassified documents offer an opportunity for honest reflection, a chance to acknowledge past mistakes, and a foundation for building a more just and open international order. The Hidden Cold War: How the CIA Secretly Engineered Coups Worldwide thus unfolds not only as a chronicle of clandestine operations but as a profound meditation on power, secrecy, and the enduring quest for freedom in an uncertain world.